Bangkok, 6:42 a.m. The tropical sunlight sliced through the heavy hotel curtains, spilling bright gold streaks across the polished hardwood floor of the five-star suite. David Collins opened his eyes, but the first sensation that hit him wasn't clarity. It was a crushing wave of dizziness, like stepping off a spinning carnival ride. His tongue felt like sandpaper, his throat parched, and every thud of his heartbeat pounded in his skull like a drum. He reached instinctively for his left side, then froze. Beneath the crisp white duvet, his fingertips brushed over skin pulled tight under thick gauze. Underneath, there was a deep, sharp, metallic ache. He yanked the blanket away, lifted his pajama shirt. Fresh white bandages, the edges still stained with spots of bright red. Black surgical sutures ran in a precise, clinical line, too clean to be anything but the work of a skilled surgeon. Memories from the night before flickered. Cold champagne, bass-heavy music thumping in his chest, neon lights flickering across the flawless face of a young woman in a red dress. Araya. The way her lips curved when she tipped her cocktail, her English laced with a lilting Thai accent. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with menthol cigarettes. They had laughed, danced, flirted, and then nothing. Just a blank void. He remembered falling into bed with her, and then blackout. David tried to take a deep breath, but pain stabbed through his back, slicing his air in half. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead. His instinct screamed to grab his phone, but when his feet hit the floor, the room swayed like a ship in rough seas. He steadied himself against the bed frame, eyes scanning the room. His clothes were draped neatly over a chair, his wallet on the nightstand. Cash and credit cards, untouched. But his $12,000 Rolex was gone. And so was Araya. He called the front desk, voice hoarse, demanding an ambulance immediately. 10 minutes later, 2 hotel medics rushed in. One spoke Thai, the other enough English to ask, "Did you fall? Were you attacked?" David just shook his head, pointing to his left side. When they peeled back the gauze, one of the medics let out a low whistle. "This cut, it's surgical. Professional." The ambulance tore through Bangkok's morning traffic, sirens splitting the city's noise. In the back, David stared at the cold white ceiling lights, palms slick with sweat. A single thought gripped him like a vice. This wasn't an accident, and it sure as hell wasn't sleepwalking. Someone had cut him open and taken something. At the International Hospital, a Thai doctor in a spotless white coat clipped a CT scan to the light board. His voice was calm, but the words landed like a blade. "You have only one kidney. The left one was removed." This was a very clean surgery, modern techniques, not amateur work. It felt like the blood drained from David's body for a second time. Araya's face flashed in his mind, her sly smile, her deep brown eyes locking onto his, the special cocktail she'd mixed for him. The pieces were snapping together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than any nightmare. He didn't know it yet, but that morning was only the first step into a world where human bodies were currency, and the night he'd spent with Araya would be carved into him forever, both in the scar on his side and in his mind. David Collins wasn't the type of man who usually let his guard down. At 38, he had built a comfortable life for himself back in Boston, CEO of a mid-sized medical equipment import company, the kind of guy who wore custom suits during the day and kept a Peloton in his living room for the evenings. He was smart, disciplined, and by most people's standards, successful. But beneath the polished exterior, there were cracks. His 12-year marriage had ended in a bitter divorce just 8 months earlier, leaving him with an empty condo, a string of awkward first dates, and a gnawing sense that maybe he'd missed out on the excitement the world had to offer. When his company landed a major lead with a Thai distributor in Bangkok, David saw the trip as more than just business. It was a chance to shake off the weight of the past year, to feel alive again. He booked himself a direct flight from Boston to Suvarnabhumi International, opting for first class, a small luxury he told himself he'd earned. The deal he was chasing could open an entirely new market for his company. But in the back of his mind, there was also the thrill of being somewhere far away from home, somewhere no one knew him, somewhere he could be anyone he wanted for a few nights. Bangkok hit him like a wave the moment he stepped out of the airport. The thick, humid air carried a mix of street food spices, exhaust fumes, and the faint sweetness of tropical flowers. The chaos of the city was intoxicating. Motorbikes weaving through traffic like schools of fish, neon signs stacked on top of each other, vendors calling out in Thai over the sizzle of skewers on open grills. His hotel, a glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the Sukhumvit district, rose like an oasis above the madness. From his suite on the 29th floor, he could see the city stretch endlessly, skyscrapers piercing the smoggy horizon. The first 2 days were all business. Meetings with executives from the Thai distributor, formal dinners with polite small talk, the careful dance of negotiation. But by the third evening, the deal was essentially sealed, and David found himself with a night free. He planned to stay in, maybe order room service, and call it early. But Bangkok's nightlife was a gravitational pull few could resist, and the city's heartbeat seemed to get louder as the sun went down. At the recommendation of one of the distributor's younger managers, David decided to check out a rooftop bar called the Crimson Lotus, perched atop a luxury hotel not far from his own. The elevator ride up felt like ascending into another world, glass walls revealing the city glowing beneath him, the river winding like a dark ribbon through the maze of lights. When the doors opened, he was greeted by soft jazz remixed with electronic beats, the clink of cocktail glasses, and the scent of imported cigars. That's when he saw her. Araya. She was standing at the far end of the bar, a figure in a crimson silk dress that caught the light with every subtle movement. Her hair was glossy and dark, falling over one shoulder, her skin warm-toned under the golden glow of the hanging lanterns. She held a martini glass like it was an extension of herself, her nails painted the same deep red as her dress. There was an ease in her posture, the kind that comes from knowing you're being watched and enjoying it. David wasn't the type to walk up to a stranger cold, but Araya caught his gaze and didn't look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a silent invitation. By the time he made his way over, she was already smiling like they'd known each other for years. "You're not from here," she said, her English crisp but accented, the vowels stretched just enough to make the words linger. "Boston," David replied, sliding onto the bar stool next to hers. "And you?" She laughed softly. "Bangkok, born and raised. But I know enough about Boston to say your winters are too cold for me." They talked about travel, about food, about the city's best-kept secrets. Araya told him she'd studied hospitality management and now worked in luxury client services, though she didn't elaborate on what that meant. She was quick with a joke, her laughter warm but never loud, and she seemed genuinely interested in him. It had been a long time since David felt that kind of undivided attention. One drink became 2, then 3. They moved from the bar to a table near the glass railing, the city sprawling out beneath them like a living circuit board. At some point, Araya suggested they go dancing. "If you've never been to a Bangkok club, you haven't really been to Bangkok," she teased. The club she chose was tucked away in an alley lit by flickering neon signs, the bass thumping so hard it rattled in his chest. Inside, the air was thick with heat and perfume, bodies moving in rhythm under strobes and lasers. Araya danced like she owned the floor, pulling David into her orbit, her hands warm against his neck. The music blurred time. The only things that mattered were her smile, the scent of her perfume, and the rush of being exactly where he was in that moment. By the time they tumbled into a taxi together, Bangkok was deep into the small hours, but the city still pulsed outside the windows. Araya leaned her head on his shoulder, tracing lazy circles on his arm with her fingertip. David thought about how the trip had started as just another business venture, how careful and calculated his life usually was. But that night, with Araya beside him, it felt like maybe he was finally breaking free of all that. He had no idea that the freedom he was chasing would cost him more than he could ever afford to lose. The taxi ride back to David's hotel felt like it existed outside of time. Bangkok's chaos blurred into streaks of neon and taillights, the muffled hum of the city fading under the soft cadence of Araya's voice. She leaned in close, her perfume something floral and expensive, wrapping around him like a warm fog. Every so often, she'd laugh at something he said, the sound soft and deliberate, and her hand would brush his knee as if by accident. By the time they stepped out under the marble awning of the hotel, David's pulse was already running ahead of him. Inside, the air conditioning kissed the back of his neck as they walked through the gleaming lobby. The concierge barely looked up. Five-star hotels in Bangkok were used to this kind of scene. In the elevator, Araya pressed the button for the 29th floor, her reflection in the mirrored walls catching David's eye. She looked calm, in control, like someone who'd been here 100 times before. David chalked it up to confidence. When the suite door clicked shut behind them, it was as if the city vanished, leaving just the two of them suspended in a private world. Araya set her clutch on the console table, kicked off her heels, and drifted toward the minibar. "Champagne?" she asked without turning around. David loosened his tie, watching her move. "Sure." She bent at the waist to retrieve a chilled bottle, the silk of her dress rippling over her frame. With practiced ease, she popped the cork and poured 2 flutes, adding a dash of something from a small vial she produced from her clutch. The motion was so quick and casual that David barely registered it before she handed him a glass. "To Bangkok," she said, raising hers. "To Bangkok," he echoed, and they drank. The champagne was crisp, with a faint bitterness that lingered at the back of his tongue. They moved to the balcony, the city sprawling below like a restless constellation. They talked, laughed, and sipped, the air between them charged. When they came back inside, the room felt warmer, the lights dimmer. Araya took his hand and led him toward the bed, her eyes locked on his like she was daring him to look away. What happened next came in fragments. The rustle of silk, the heat of her skin, the rhythm of her breath against his neck. The world narrowed to the space they occupied, the night stretching endlessly ahead of them. But somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, David noticed a shift, a wave of dizziness rolling through him, heavier than anything champagne should have caused. Araya's voice was suddenly distant, as if she were speaking from the other side of a wall. The edges of his vision blurred, and his limbs felt slow, unresponsive. He tried to laugh it off, to shake it away, but his body wasn't listening. His heart hammered in his chest, and his mouth felt full of cotton. "You're okay," she murmured, brushing his hair back. "Just relax." He tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick, the words stuck. The last clear image he had was Araya's face hovering above his, her expression unreadable. Then darkness swallowed everything. When David's eyes fluttered open again, it wasn't to morning sunlight. It was to the dim, sterile glow of the suite's bedside lamp. For a moment, he thought he'd simply slept through the night. But then came the pain, a sharp, pulling ache in his left side, deep and foreign, like something had been hollowed out inside him. He rolled onto his back, disoriented. The sheets beneath him were slightly rumpled, but otherwise clean. No sign of Araya. On the nightstand sat the empty champagne flutes, one tipped over, leaving a faint ring of moisture on the glass surface. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, out of place in a hotel room. He reached down, his fingers brushing against thick gauze taped across his side. The bandage was fresh, too fresh. His breathing quickened, and with it the ache sharpened. He pulled the edge of the gauze up, just enough to see the neat black stitches beneath. It was a surgical incision, clean and deliberate, not the ragged wound of an accident. A low throb of panic began in his chest, radiating outward until his whole body buzzed with it. He scanned the room. His wallet was still there, his clothes draped neatly over a chair. But his Rolex was gone, and so was she. David stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the doorframe for support. Under the harsh light, his reflection stared back, pale, sweaty, pupils slightly dilated. He splashed water on his face, but it didn't wash away the sick realization creeping through him. He tried to remember the night, the drinks at the rooftop bar, the club, the taxi, the champagne, that bitter aftertaste. And then nothing. Somewhere, deep in his mind, the pieces started to fit together, though he wanted desperately to believe they didn't. Araya hadn't just left in the middle of the night. She'd left with something that had been inside his body hours before. The pain in his side intensified, a reminder with every breath. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, the screen blurring as he scrolled to the hotel's front desk. The call was answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse as he demanded an ambulance. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. 2 hotel medics entered, their expressions tightening when they saw the incision. One asked in halting English if he'd been attacked. David shook his head. I don't know, he rasped, but something's wrong. Something's very wrong. One medic leaned closer, inspecting the stitches. This surgery, he murmured to his partner in Thai. Very clean. David's stomach turned. The word surgery echoed in his head, twisting into something far darker. As they helped him onto a stretcher, the last thing he saw before the elevator doors closed was the faint outline of his balcony, the city lights still burning beyond. Somewhere out there, Araya was walking away with a piece of him, literally, and he had no idea that the nightmare was only just beginning. The sirens wailed through the dense Bangkok traffic, a piercing cry that cut through the humid morning air. David lay on the stretcher in the back of the ambulance, gripping the thin blanket over him. Every bump in the road sent a fresh stab of pain through his left side, and the sterile scent of the vehicle only intensified the nausea swirling in his gut. The medic riding beside him kept glancing down at the incision, his brow furrowed, as if he couldn't quite reconcile what he was seeing with the setting they were in. By the time they arrived at the gleaming facade of Bangkok International Hospital, David's mind was spinning in circles. The questions came fast and relentless. How could this happen? Why me? But the bigger question was one he didn't want to say out loud. What exactly did they take? Inside the emergency bay, the transition was immediate. Cool, climate-controlled air wrapped around him. Bright fluorescent lights blazed overhead. A team in crisp white coats and pale blue scrubs descended on him, switching effortlessly between Thai and English. Someone slid a clipboard onto his lap for consent forms. Another started in 4. When the CT scan results came back, the attending physician, a tall man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses, pulled David into a small consultation room. He spoke slowly, each word weighted, his English deliberate and precise. Mr. Collins, your left kidney has been surgically removed. The suturing is professional. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. David stared at him, trying to process the sentence. It didn't land all at once. It was more like a series of blows. Left kidney, surgically removed. Professional. He felt his hands start to tremble. That's not possible. I was at my hotel. His voice cracked, the rest of the words lost in the lump in his throat. The doctor leaned forward, lowering his voice. This is not the first case we have seen. There are people who operate like this. Organized. Very dangerous. You were lucky to wake up. Lucky. The word felt absurd, almost insulting. Hospital staff contacted the local police. 2 plainclothes officers arrived within an hour, notebooks in hand. They asked about the night before, about Araya, about the club. David recounted everything he could remember, how they met, the champagne, the sudden dizziness. But when they pressed him for her last name, her contact information, anything concrete, he had nothing. Just her first name and the memory of a red dress. One officer stepped out to make a call, while the other scrolled through David's phone with his permission, checking for messages or photos that might help. The bitter truth was clear. Araya hadn't left a single trace. Back at the hotel, investigators pulled surveillance footage. Hours later, they returned with a still image printed on glossy paper. Araya, leaving the 29th floor at 3:17 a.m., flanked by 2 men in pale green surgical scrubs. One carried a black duffel bag, the other wheeled a suitcase. Their faces were turned just enough to dodge the camera's full view. The officer set the photo on the table in front of David. Do you know them? David shook his head. His chest felt tight, as though the air in the room had thickened. The reality settled in with crushing weight. This wasn't some isolated crime of opportunity. It was precise, coordinated, and practiced. They hadn't just taken a kidney. They'd taken it with a surgeon's efficiency and vanished into the city before sunrise. Over the next few hours, David underwent more tests. The remaining kidney was functioning, but the doctors warned him he'd need to adjust his lifestyle. Lower protein intake, no contact sports, regular monitoring for the rest of his life. A lifetime sentence, courtesy of one night's bad decision. Between the blood draws and the police interviews, he caught glimpses of Bangkok's morning through the hospital window. The streets bustled as if nothing had happened. Street vendors flipping skewers, tuk-tuks weaving between cars, tourists snapping photos. The city didn't care that he was lying here, marked and altered forever. Late in the afternoon, an officer returned with a list of questions about the vial Araya had used, about any taste or smell in the champagne. David remembered the faint bitterness, the heaviness that had crept over him like a blanket. The officer nodded grimly. Likely ketamine and midazolam. Fast, strong sedatives. You wouldn't have been able to fight. That night, lying in the hospital bed, David stared at the ceiling, the steady beep of the heart monitor ticking away the hours. Sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, the shimmer of Araya's dress under the rooftop lights, the icy burn of champagne. The moment his vision began to tunnel, he could almost feel her hand on his chest, hear her whisper, "Just relax." But beneath those images was something darker, a realization that clawed at him. He hadn't just been unlucky. He'd been chosen. Marked the moment he walked into that bar, scanned, weighed, and deemed worth the risk. This wasn't random. And whoever they were, they'd done it before. The fear was still fresh, but something else was beginning to take root beneath it. Not quite anger, not yet resolve, but the first glimmer of a truth he couldn't ignore. They'd taken a part of him, but they hadn't finished the job. He was still here, and now he knew they were, too. The Bangkok Metropolitan Police didn't waste time. By the morning after David's surgery, Detective Chaiwat Srisuk, lean, sharp-eyed, with the permanent squint of someone who'd seen too much, was sitting at the foot of his hospital bed. His English was clipped but clear, his questions rapid-fire. "You met her where?" "The rooftop bar." "Name?" "Araya," David said. "That's all she gave me." "No last name." David shook his head. "Phone number? Social media?" "Nothing." She said she liked keeping things simple. Chaiwat's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd heard this before. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment theft. This was a script rehearsed to perfection. By mid-morning, a small forensics team arrived at the hotel. They swept David's suite for prints, fibers, any trace of the woman in the red dress or the two men seen in the grainy surveillance still. The problem was five-star hotels in Bangkok weren't exactly eager to cooperate with investigations that might scare away wealthy guests. The staff handed over footage, but the cameras in the hallway only caught the trio leaving the elevator, not entering David's room. Whoever orchestrated this knew exactly where the blind spots were. Back at the hospital, a narcotics specialist joined the questioning. She explained that the sedatives likely used, ketamine and midazolam, could knock out an average adult male in under 3 minutes. Mixed into alcohol, she said, you'd never stand a chance. David clenched his jaw. The taste, the slight bitterness in the champagne, it all came back. He felt the heat rise in his chest, a sick mix of shame and fury. The investigators traced the champagne bottle from the hotel minibar. It had been opened, but there was no security seal and no way to tell when it had been tampered with. Forensics found no prints on the glasses except David's own. The vial she'd poured from? Gone. Late that afternoon, Chaiwat returned with an update. We identified the men in the video. Not names yet, but the uniforms, they're not real hospital. Costume, bought in Chatuchak Market. We find same pattern used in other cases. David blinked. Other cases? The detective nodded grimly. 3 in last year. 4 men, tourists. Similar method. Meet woman, drink, wake up with surgery wound. All lost kidney. 2 happened in Phuket, 1 in Pattaya. We think same group. A cold weight settled in David's gut. You're telling me this is organized? Yes. Organized, careful. Not small street criminals. We believe they have real medical knowledge, doctor or nurse. They use temporary clinic. Move fast. Disappear. The next step was tracing Araya herself. Detectives pulled stills from the rooftop bar's security cameras, sending them to immigration checkpoints, airports, and bus terminals. But in a city of nearly 11 million, with a nightlife that swelled with transient workers and expats, a single face could vanish in hours. Meanwhile, Interpol was contacted. Organ trafficking wasn't just a local problem, it was an international one. Reports from the Middle East and Eastern Europe suggested that black market kidneys could sell for upwards of $150,000. The buyers were often desperate patients in countries with long transplant wait lists, willing to pay for donor organs without asking too many questions. That night, David lay awake replaying every detail of his interaction with Araya. Her confident smile, the way she seemed to know exactly how to draw him in, her casual mention of having studied hospitality management. It clicked now. Maybe she had studied something else entirely. Maybe hospitality was just a convenient word for luring strangers into rooms where someone else was waiting with a scalpel. The following day, Chaiwat brought David to the police station for a formal statement. The building was a squat concrete structure buzzing with fans and the low murmur of voices. In a small interview room, he went through the events again, this time with timestamps and as much precision as he could muster. Afterward, Chaiwat spread out a series of photographs across the table. These are from similar cases, he said. Some are mugshots of arrested traffickers. Others were crime scene photos. Hotel rooms stripped bare, blood-stained linens, discarded surgical gloves. David's stomach churned as he studied them. One photo caught his eye. A young woman in a black dress, smiling on a club balcony in Pattaya. She wasn't Araya, but she had the same poise, the same predatory grace. They changed faces often, Chaiwat said, as if reading his mind. Wigs, colored contacts, new clothes. Hard to track. Over the next week, David remained in Bangkok for follow-up medical care while the investigation unfolded. Police canvassed bars, clubs, and high-end hotels in Sukhumvit and Salem, showing Araya's picture to bartenders and security staff. A handful recognized her, sometimes under different names, but no one knew where she lived. Then came the first real lead. A taxi driver remembered picking up a woman in a red dress and two men in green scrubs around 3:20 a.m. the night of the incident. They'd instructed him to drive to a riverside warehouse district and paid him double to forget the trip. When police visited the location, they found an abandoned building with a faint chemical smell lingering in the air and a few medical supply boxes left behind. It was a temporary surgical site, cleaned out but not perfectly. Forensics lifted a partial print from one of the boxes. Through Interpol, that print matched a Malaysian national named Dr. Harun Salah, a disgraced surgeon who'd lost his license 5 years earlier after being implicated in illegal transplant surgeries. He'd vanished before trial. Now it seemed he was plying his trade in the shadows, moving from country to country. Chaiwat explained it bluntly. We think Araya is recruiter. Harun is surgeon. The other man? Probably anesthesiologist or assistant. They find victim, operate, organ out in under an hour. Then courier takes kidney to buyer, usually on next flight. The precision chilled David. These weren't thugs improvising in a dirty motel. This was a mobile operating theater executed with the skill of people who'd once been legitimate professionals. Still, the investigation moved slowly. Without catching them in the act, charges would be difficult to prove, especially if the suspects fled Thailand. Chaiwat was candid. You are lucky to be alive. But this group, they will not stop. We must catch them working. The phrase stuck with David long after he left the station. Catch them working. It meant more people would have to be put at risk, maybe even hurt, before there was enough to bring them down. The idea made his skin crawl. On the ride back to his hotel, the city seemed different, colder, despite the oppressive heat. Every woman at a bar, every pair of eyes meeting his from across a room, carried the shadow of Araya's smile. And every shadow, he realized, might hide someone else's nightmare waiting to happen. The break in the case came from an unexpected angle. 2 weeks after the attack, while David was still in Bangkok under medical observation, Detective Chaiwat called him back to the station. His tone over the phone was different, sharper, urgent. We found something, he said. In the conference room, a projector flickered to life, displaying a map of Southeast Asia dotted with red pins. These, Chaiwat began, pointing with a capped pen, are confirmed incidents in the last 3 years. Victims, mostly foreign men, same method. Targeted in nightlife districts, drugged, taken to temporary surgical sites, 1 kidney removed. The pins here, he tapped Bangkok, Pattaya, Phuket, are Thailand. But the others? Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore. Interpol had been building a case on a suspected organ trafficking network operating across borders. The group used recruiters, often women who could charm and disarm their targets, paired with medical professionals who'd either lost their licenses or walked away from legitimate careers to make a fortune in the shadows. Their mobility was their strength. They never used the same location twice, never stayed in one country for more than a few months, and laundered their profits through shell companies and cash couriers. On the table in front of David were printed profiles. He recognized one instantly. The Malaysian surgeon, Dr. Harun Salah. Beneath his photo was a timeline of disciplinary actions, investigations for improper procedures, patient deaths, falsified records, culminating in his disappearance 5 years ago. Interpol now believed he was the lead surgeon for the network. Next was a man named Somchai Ratanakorn, a Thai national and former anesthesiologist dismissed from a private hospital in Chiang Mai for suspected theft of controlled substances. His expertise, Chaiwat explained, made him invaluable. He keeps the victims under, makes sure they don't wake up during procedure. Fast, clean. And then there was Araya, or at least the woman David knew as Araya. Her real name, according to immigration records, was Nacha Faisuk. 25 years old, a Thai-Filipina dual citizen. She'd worked briefly as a nurse's assistant in Manila before moving to Bangkok. No criminal record, but her passport showed a travel pattern that mirrored the group's suspected movements almost exactly. She's what we call a lure, Chaiwat said. Beautiful, confident, speaks enough English to gain trust. She spots the victim, makes contact, and delivers them. David felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He'd known she was more than just a random predator, but hearing it laid out so clinically drove the reality deeper. She hadn't just been playing a part. This was her part, rehearsed and perfected. The deeper Chaiwat went, the more disturbing the picture became. The group's operations were timed like clockwork. After the lure secured the victim, the anesthesiologist administered sedatives, sometimes in drinks, sometimes via a quick injection disguised as playful contact. The victim would be transported to a clean site, an apartment or warehouse retrofitted with basic surgical equipment. Dr. Harun would perform the nephrectomy, removing the kidney in under 90 minutes. The organ would be packed in a sterile container with ice, loaded into a cooler, and placed in the hands of courier. That courier was often on a plane within hours, heading to destinations where black market transplants were arranged in private clinics for wealthy clients who could pay 6 figures in cash. The organs were sold for anywhere between $120,000 and $150,000. Victims were left sedated in hotel rooms, with just enough post-op care to keep them alive, but never enough to prevent infection or long-term damage. For the traffickers, it was low risk, high reward. Many victims, embarrassed, fearful, or unwilling to deal with foreign police, never reported the crime. Those who did rarely had enough information to identify their attackers. Interpol's file included interviews with survivors. A British tourist in Phuket had woken up in a beachside bungalow with the same kind of incision David bore. An Australian backpacker in Ho Chi Minh City had been targeted in much the same way. Different woman, same outcome. A Canadian businessman in Kuala Lumpur had been too ashamed to tell his wife why he came home with a surgical scar and lingering medical issues. As the detective spoke, David felt his anger crystallizing. This wasn't just about him. He was part of a list, a commodity line item in some ledger kept by people who saw human bodies as inventory. The Thai police, working with Interpol, began tracking the group's financial patterns. Cash deposits appeared in multiple currencies across bank accounts in Hong Kong, Dubai, and Cyprus. Shell companies listed as medical supply importers matched up with travel records for Harun and Somchai. Araya's movements, captured through hotel check-ins and CCTV, with a breadcrumb trail leading investigators from one country to the next. One especially chilling discovery came from a confiscated phone in Malaysia belonging to a low-level fixer connected to the network. Among the messages were photos of organs in sterile containers, each labeled with a date, blood type, and destination. One image, time-stamped the morning after David's surgery, showed a kidney labeled O+/BKK. "They photographed mine," David said quietly, the words tasting like iron in his mouth. "Yes," Chaiwat replied, "and sold it within 12 hours. Despite the progress, catching them in the act remained the only surefire way to secure convictions. Without direct evidence of the surgery taking place, most charges would crumble under legal scrutiny. That meant setting a trap, and it would have to be baited with someone a group would find irresistible. In the meantime, the Thai media had gotten wind of the investigation. Headlines blared warnings about the nightlife organ harvesters. Tourists were cautioned not to accept drinks from strangers. But Chaiwat was skeptical the coverage would help. "They will just move quieter, or go to another city. They have contacts everywhere." For David, the brief satisfaction of seeing the network's inner workings was tempered by frustration. They were still out there, still hunting, and his life would never be the same. The scar on his side was healing, but the sense of violation was permanent. He wasn't just missing an organ. He was missing the sense of invulnerability he'd carried his whole life. Before he left the station, Chaiwat slid a photo across the table. It was grainy CCTV from an upscale bar in Manila, taken just 2 months earlier. Natcha, was sitting at a table, laughing with a man in a suit. The timestamp was 11:43 p.m. "She moves fast," Chaiwat said, "and she will keep moving until we stop her." David stared at the photo for a long time, committing every detail of her face to memory. The anger in his chest wasn't a wildfire anymore. It was something colder, sharper. They'd taken his kidney, but they hadn't taken his will to see them caught. Somewhere in the tangle of neon-lit streets and smoky backrooms, Araya and her partners were already looking for their next mark. And if the police were right, the only way to end it was to catch them mid-cut, with the blood still on their gloves. The sting operation had been in the works for nearly a month. Thai police, with Interpol watching every move, knew they couldn't rely on luck to catch the organ trafficking crew. They had to set the stage, control every variable, and make sure the suspect had nowhere to run. The bait would be a man who fit their profile perfectly: foreign, wealthy-looking, alone, and comfortable enough in the city to take a risk. That man turned out to be a young Australian undercover operative named Alex Mercer. He was tall, fit, with an easy smile and a Rolex that wasn't quite real, but convincing enough to flash in the right light. For 2 weeks, Alex played the role of a jet-setting consultant in Bangkok, frequenting rooftop bars, high-end clubs, and restaurants known to attract both tourists and predatory locals. The police knew from past cases that Araya, Natcha, liked to work in familiar territory. Surveillance teams rotated shifts, watching every entrance of the Crimson Lotus, the same rooftop bar where she'd met David. And sure enough, one Thursday night, just past 10 p.m., she appeared. The red dress was gone, replaced by a sleek black jumpsuit, but her movements were the same, graceful, unhurried, a predator in no rush to pounce. From the corner table, Alex played his part. He nursed a whiskey, scrolling his phone as if bored, letting the watch catch the light. Within 20 minutes, Natcha drifted over, her smile warm, her body language open. They exchanged pleasantries. She asked about his work, where he was staying, and, most importantly, how long he'd be in Bangkok. The conversation was smooth, natural, just like it had been with David. Hidden in Alex's jacket was a miniature transmitter broadcasting every word to a team stationed in a van 3 blocks away. Detective Chaiwat listened, jotting notes as Natcha steered the conversation toward drinks. She suggested champagne, something special, and insisted she'd make it herself. This was the signal. Undercover officers posing as bar staff watched as she discreetly poured from a small vial into Alex's glass, the motion as casual as flicking away a piece of lint. He drank, wincing just enough for her to notice, then leaned back like the sedatives were beginning to work. Within minutes, Two men appeared, green scrubs under loose jackets, surgical masks pulled down around their necks. They greeted Nat Cha with the familiarity of colleagues. Then each took an arm, helping Alex to his feet. From a distance, it could have looked like they were assisting a drunk friend. The trio exited through the service elevator, exactly as they had with David. But this time, they didn't vanish into the city. A second surveillance team followed in unmarked cars, headlights off, as the suspects loaded Alex into a black Toyota van. The convoy wound through Bangkok's narrow backstreets, eventually pulling into a dimly lit warehouse district by the Chao Phraya River. Inside the van, Alex fought to keep his breathing steady, pretending the drugs were taking full effect while his earpiece crackled with updates. "Hold," Chewat's voice instructed. "Wait for the handoff." The suspects carried him into a two-story building that, from the outside, looked abandoned. Inside, it was anything but. One room had been converted into a crude but functional operating theater. Folding tables draped with sterile sheets, 4 bags hanging from hooks, a bright surgical lamp suspended over a padded gurney. Stainless steel trays held scalpels, clamps, and sutures laid out in meticulous order. Dr. Haroon was there, masked and gloved, his eyes cold above the fabric. Somchai prepared in 4-line, while Natcha leaned against the wall, scrolling her phone like she had all the time in the world. Alex let his head loll to the side, keeping his breathing slow as Haroon checked his pulse. "We start now," Haroon said in Thai. That was the moment. Chewat's voice came through Alex's earpiece, low and sharp. "Go." The doors burst open with a crash, armed officers flooding the room in a coordinated wave. "Police! Down! Down!" The shout echoed off the concrete walls. Haroon froze, scalpel in hand, before dropping it with a metallic clatter. Somchai bolted for the side exit, but was tackled before he could make it 3 steps. Natcha's phone slipped from her hand as she tried to back toward the wall, her face twisting from calm confidence to sheer panic. The operation was over in under a minute. Haroon, Somchai, and Natcha were cuffed, read their rights, and led past the bright surgical lights into the humid Bangkok night. Outside, vans waited to transport them to holding cells, where Interpol agents were already preparing extradition requests for the countries with the strongest cases. In the van, Natcha glanced once at Alex, realization dawning on her face. "You," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "you're not a tourist." Alex didn't answer. He just met her gaze for a moment before turning away. Back at the station, the evidence was cataloged. Surgical tools, sedatives, fake medical IDs, and a cooler half filled with melting ice, the container they planned to use for Alex's kidney. Digital forensics teams began combing through Natcha's phone and a laptop found in the warehouse office. Inside were photos, travel itineraries, payment records, and a chilling spreadsheet listing dates, blood types, and initials, likely victims from across multiple countries. For David, the call from Chaiwat came just before midnight. "We have them," the detective said simply. "All 3. David sat in silence for a long moment, the news washing over him. It didn't give him back what he'd lost, but it was something, proof that the people who had treated him like inventory were finally off the street. Somewhere in Bangkok, in the same city where he'd woken up to a nightmare, the people who had caused it were now staring at concrete walls instead of neon lights. And for the first time since that night, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could breathe. The trial began 6 months later in Bangkok's criminal court, a gray, imposing building that seemed to swallow the humid air outside. Reporters crowded the steps from sunrise, cameras flashing every time the prison van arrived. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, a mix of legal formality and raw human emotion. David sat in the gallery, dressed in a simple navy suit. His scar had healed into a thin, pale line on his side, but the phantom ache was still there, worse when he thought about the night he met Araya. He watched as the 3 defendants were led in. Dr. Haroon, his once pristine demeanor now dulled by months in custody. Somchai, smaller in stature, eyes darting nervously around the room. And Natcha, Araya, her hair pulled back, wearing a beige prison uniform. Even in shackles, she carried herself with a strange, unshaken poise, as if she were walking a runway no one else could see. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a detailed picture of the organ trafficking network, introducing evidence collected during the sting operation, the surgical tools, the sedatives, the cooler of melting ice that had been meant for Alex Mercer's kidney. Digital records linked the group to at least 7 confirmed victims across 4 countries, with payment trails leading to offshore accounts. Photographs from Natch's phone showed her with various men in different cities, sometimes in bars, sometimes in hotel rooms. Faces blurred, but the pattern unmistakable. David was called to testify on the second day. Taking the stand, he felt the weight of the courtroom's gaze settle on him. The prosecutor guided him through his account of the night at the Crimson Lotus, the champagne, the sudden dizziness, and waking up with a surgical incision. His voice wavered only once, when the prosecutor asked what it felt like to know the part of him had been sold to a stranger. "It's not just the organ," David said quietly, glancing toward the defense table where Natcha sat expressionless. "It's knowing someone saw you as nothing more than a payday, that they could take something from you and expect you to just keep walking." The defense tried to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. Haroon's attorney claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the surgical tools could have been planted. Somkai's lawyer argued his client had no idea what was happening, portraying him as a low-level assistant caught in over his head. Natch's defense was the most aggressive. Her attorney suggested she'd been coerced by the men, that she was just a frightened young woman lured into a criminal enterprise she didn't understand. But the undercover footage from Alex Mercer told a different story. Jurors watched as she spiked his drink, smiled, and guided him toward the service elevator. They heard her laugh with Haroon and Somchai as they prepared the operating table. Any illusion of coercion shattered in that moment. As the trial stretched into its 3rd week, the media frenzy only grew. International outlets covered it as a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in nightlife districts and the global demand for black market organs. Tourists visiting Bangkok saw posters at airports warning against accepting drinks from strangers. When the verdicts came down, the courtroom was packed so tightly that latecomers stood along the walls. Haroon was found guilty on multiple counts of aggravated assault, kidnapping, and human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Somchai received 32 years for his role in the surgeries and sedation. And Natcha, her expression never changing as the judge read the sentence, was given 25 years for conspiracy, kidnapping, and administering harmful substances. The judge noted that her active role in selecting and luring victims undermined her claim of coercion. For David, the sentences brought a complicated mix of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it didn't undo the damage. He still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear the sound of Araya's voice telling him to just relax. In the weeks after the trial, the fallout spread. Interpol used the case to push for greater cooperation between Southeast Asian nations on organ trafficking investigations. Thai police conducted raids on suspected safe houses, arresting low-level operatives who'd slipped through the cracks. Hospitals began working more closely with law enforcement to track the sale and movement of surgical equipment. Back in Boston, David was approached by a network news program to tell his story. He hesitated at first, wary of reliving it all, but eventually agreed. Sitting under the bright studio lights, he spoke directly into the camera. "I thought I was just another guy on a business trip, blowing off steam. I didn't know I was walking into a machine, one that chews people up and sells them off piece by piece." The segment went viral. Emails poured in from viewers, some thanking him for speaking out, others sharing their own narrow escapes from similar schemes. One came from a man in Canada who'd been attacked in Kuala Lumpur in almost the exact same way, but had never gone to the police. David didn't feel like a hero, but he began to see his survival as a responsibility. He partnered with an anti-trafficking nonprofit, speaking at conferences about the warning signs and vulnerabilities predators look for. The scar on his side became more than a reminder of what was taken. It became a visible marker of what he'd endured and what he was determined to fight against. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when the city was asleep when he thought about Nat Cha, about how easily she'd slipped past his defenses, how natural it had felt to trust her, and about how many other Arayas were still out there, smiling at someone across a bar, waiting for the right moment to strike. Justice had caught up with his crew, but the machine? It was still running, and David knew that somewhere, another story just like his was already unfolding. It was a cold spring evening in Boston when David Collins stood by the window of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline. The streetlights glowed against the darkening sky. Cars moved in slow streams below, and somewhere far away, he could hear the faint hum of life going on, as usual. He traced a finger along the thin scar on his side, the skin still sensitive under his touch. It was a part of him now, as permanent as the memory it carried. In the months since the trial, he had returned to work, rebuilt his routines, and even started to laugh again. But something inside him had shifted forever. Before Bangkok, he believed that danger was something you could see coming, that it wore a mask you could spot if you were paying attention. Now he knew better. Sometimes danger smiled at you across a cocktail glass, asked about your hometown, and made you feel seen. David spoke publicly a handful of times after the verdict, always ending his story the same way, with a warning. He told audiences that predators like Araya didn't just hunt in dark alleys. They hunted in rooftop bars, five-star hotels, and anywhere people's guards were down. That they didn't need to rob you of your wallet to ruin your life. You think it won't happen to you, he'd say, because you're smart, careful, maybe even a little paranoid. I thought the same thing. But they don't need you to be stupid. They just need you to be human. His words stuck with people because they were true. The organ trafficking network that had taken his kidney wasn't the only one out there. The arrests in Bangkok had dented the machine, but hadn't destroyed it. Somewhere, in another city, someone else was already being marked, targeted, and followed. David kept the photo of Araya that the police had given him, the grainy still from the rooftop bar, tucked in a drawer. Not because he wanted to remember her, but because he never wanted to forget what she represented. A reminder that trust, once broken, changes the way you see the world. That night, as he stood by the glass, the city lights shimmering below, he knew he would never set foot in Bangkok again. But he also knew his story wasn't just about Bangkok. It was about how quickly the ground could shift beneath you, how a single choice could alter the rest of your life. He turned away from the window, the scar still faintly aching under his shirt. Somewhere, another man was ordering another drink, smiling at a stranger in a dress. And somewhere, someone like Araya was smiling back.